The pilot survived. The plane disappeared. Until one discovery rewrote history.
The Brewster Buffalo did not crash. When it hit the lake, it vanished, swallowed whole by black water and silence, as if history itself had decided to bury the evidence. The scream of the engine cut off mid-note. 1 second it was there, tearing the frozen air apart, and the next it was gone, replaced by the hollow clap of impact and a shock wave that rippled across the lake's skin. Men on the far shore saw the splash rise like a dark wing and then collapse inward, leaving nothing but widening rings and drifting shards of ice. No fire, no smoke, just absence. They wrote "lost to water" in the logbook and moved on. The year was 1942. Finland was fighting for survival in a war that did not care about footnotes or forgotten serial numbers. BW-372 was just another Brewster Buffalo, obsolete to some, indispensable to others, one of the few fighters standing between the northern skies and annihilation. But to the pilot who flew her that morning, she was not a number. She was stubborn, temperamental, and alive in a way only combat aircraft ever are. Second Lieutenant Eero Kallio had known something was wrong even before the engine began to cough. The Buffalo vibrated beneath him as he climbed, subtle shudder that traveled up through the control column and into his arms. Oil pressure wavered. The gauges told a story he didn't like. He glanced once at the frozen forests below, then back to the horizon, jaw tightening. Turning back meant shame. Pressing on meant risk. The war did not reward caution. When the engine finally failed, it did so without drama. No explosion. No heroic fireball. Just a dead propeller slicing uselessly through air that suddenly felt too quiet. Kallio's world narrowed to speed, altitude, and a rapidly approaching lake he recognized too late. He never screamed. The Buffalo struck the water belly first, tearing through ice like glass. The cockpit filled in seconds. Cold so intense it felt like pain detonated inside his chest. The canopy jammed. He clawed at it until his fingers went numb, then forced it open with a last, violent shove as the aircraft dragged him down. When he surfaced, coughing blood and lake water, the Brewster was already gone. BW-372 slid into the mud nose first, the lake sealing over her like a closing eye. For decades, the lake kept its secret. Snow fell, ice formed and cracked, reeds grew and died. Fishermen crossed the surface in winter, never knowing they stood above a fighter plane resting upright in the darkness, wings intact, propeller buried, guns still loaded. War ended. Borders shifted. Names were etched into stone. BW-372 remained. The idea that she might still be there surfaced occasionally, whispered among aviation historians, divers, and men who preferred uncomfortable truths. Old crash reports were vague. Coordinates were approximate. Survivors remembered a lake, but there were many lakes, and memories had softened with time, until one winter evening nearly 60 years later, when a historian named Mika Laakson stared at a yellowed mission log and felt something click into place. He had spent years chasing ghosts, aircraft shot down, written off, erased by paperwork. Most hunts ended with disappointment, scrap metal, scattered debris, nothing whole. But BW-372 was different. The report described a forced landing, not an explosion, no witness to destruction, just disappearance. Laaksonen traced the pilot's route with a ruler across an old map. Wind direction, estimated glide distance, known training corridors. He circled a lake most researchers had ignored because it was too shallow to destroy an aircraft. That night he wrote one sentence in his notebook: if she went in gently, she might still be standing. The first expedition was small and cautious. No announcements, no cameras, just a team of divers, a sonar unit, and an idea fragile enough to break under scrutiny. The lake looked ordinary: dark water, muddy banks, reeds whispering in the wind. It did not look like the grave of a fighter plane. Sonar changed that. A shape appeared on the screen that did not belong to geology. Straight lines, symmetry. A shadow where none should be. The operator zoomed in, breath catching. There, he said quietly. "That's not a rock." The first diver went down blind, guided by instruments and instinct. The water swallowed him in seconds. Visibility dropped to nothing. Silt rose at the faintest movement, turning the lake into liquid night. Then his hand touched metal, cold, solid, curved. He followed it downward, fingers tracing rivets, panel seams, the unmistakable contour of a fuselage. When his glove brushed across the painted letters half buried in mud, his heart hammered against his ribs. BW-372, he surfaced shaking, voice unsteady as he reported what he'd found. No cheering followed, just silence, heavy with realization. They had found her. Now came the harder question, should they raise her? Raising a warplane from a lake is not an act of recovery, it is an act of resurrection. Every bolt threatens to shear, every movement risks collapse. Decades underwater turn aluminum brittle, steel hungry for oxygen. The mud that preserves also traps, gripping the wreck like a fist that does not want to let go, and yet leaving her felt wrong. BW-372 was more than an artifact. She was a witness, a machine that had fought, failed, and endured when men could not. Her pilot had survived the crash but died years later, never knowing his aircraft waited below, almost intact, refusing to decay. The decision was made quietly, reverently. They would bring her up. The plan took years. Engineers argued, conservators warned, funding stalled and restarted. Weather windows narrowed. Every step forward required 10 calculations and 1 leap of faith. They studied photographs of Brewster Buffaloes in service, stubby, ungainly, unfairly maligned by history. They reviewed combat records that proved the aircraft had fought fiercely in Finnish hands, even as it struggled elsewhere. BW-372 had a story worth telling. By the time the recovery team assembled for real, winter had returned. Ice glazed the lake, thick enough to bear machines and men. A hole was cut where sonar had marked her resting place, steam rising like breath from an open wound. Cranes creaked. Divers checked seals. Everyone spoke softly. Somewhere beneath their feet, the Buffalo waited. When the first lifting straps slid into place, the mud resisted. The aircraft did not want to come. Divers worked by touch alone, threading supports beneath wings and fuselage, careful not to disturb the balance that had held for 60 years. Every movement sent clouds of silt blooming upward. Time stretched. Oxygen ticked down. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Brewster shifted. Mud released its grip with a soundless sigh. Above the surface, tension snapped tight. Cables sang. The crane operator eased back, millimeter by millimeter. Water churned. Something massive moved below. A shape emerged in the dark, and for a moment no one spoke, afraid that sound might break the spell. The propeller broke the surface first, bent, scarred, real. BW-372 was coming home. The moment BW-372 began to rise, the lake seemed to fight back. Water surged into the cavity left behind, collapsing the walls of mud that had cradled the aircraft for decades. The silt thickened, dragging at cables, swallowing visibility. From above, the crane operator felt the sudden change in resistance and froze, heart hammering. "Hold," someone shouted. "Hold everything." Below, the divers clung to the fuselage, their gloved hands pressed against history. They felt the aircraft tremble not with fear but with strain. Aluminum that had rested undisturbed since the war now bore weight again. Every rivet carried a risk. Every second mattered. The recovery supervisor, Antti Korhonen, watched the gauges with narrowed eyes. He had raised boats, trucks, even tanks from water before. None of them had been this fragile or this meaningful. "This isn't salvage," he muttered. "It's surgery." They adjusted the lift, redistributed the load, inched the crane back into motion. And then at last the fuselage broke the surface. Water cascaded from the cockpit, opening in dark sheets. The Buffalo emerged like a relic dragged from myth-skin-dulled paint, ghosted but visible, national markings still clinging to the metal. Gasps rippled through the team. One man crossed himself without realizing it. BW-372 stood upright, exactly as she had gone in. Someone laughed, sharp and disbelieving. Someone else wiped their eyes. For the first time since 1942, the aircraft felt air again. They did not cheer. The silence was deliberate, respectful. This was not a victory snatched from an enemy, it was a reunion with the past. Cameras rolled quietly. Notes were taken with shaking hands. The Buffalo hung suspended, dripping lake water and memory, while engineers inspected her for signs of imminent failure. Amazingly, she held. The wings were intact, control surfaces frozen but present. The cockpit canopy warped yet recognizable. Inside, instruments stared back blindly. Needles arrested mid-story. The guns remained in place, ammunition corroded but unmistakable. The war had paused here. As the aircraft was guided onto a support cradle, Cahonan exhaled for the first time in minutes. He rested his palm against the fuselage, feeling the cold metal through his glove. "Easy," he murmured, as if she could hear him. "You're safe now." News spread faster than expected. A single photograph leaked BW-372 rising from the lake, half-submerged, markings visible. Aviation forums erupted. Historians scrambled. Journalists called. For many, the Brewster Buffalo had been a punchline of World War II. Aviation undergunned, underpowered, overshadowed by sleeker fighters. BW-372 challenged that narrative simply by existing. She was proof that the aircraft had not always failed, that in the right hands, under the right conditions, it had fought fiercely. Finnish pilots had known this. Now the world would see it too, but celebration came with pressure. The aircraft's condition was a paradox. The lake had preserved her by denying oxygen, but exposure now threatened rapid corrosion. Every hour above water accelerated decay. Concertators moved quickly, spraying inhibitors, controlling temperature, documenting every inch. Nothing could be rushed. Nothing could be careless. Inside the cockpit, they found personal traces that struck deeper than any technical detail. A glove wedged beside the seat. A bent checklist card, scratches on the canopy frame where fingers had clawed in panic or determination. These were not artifacts, they were moments. Someone asked aloud whether the pilot had survived. "Yes," Laaksonen replied quietly. He lived. He walked away from the lake. That knowledge settled over the team like a blessing. Transporting BW-372 proved harder than lifting her. The roads were not built for ghosts. The aircraft could not be disassembled without risking collapse. Engineers designed a custom frame, distributing weight across reinforced points, every strap padded, every vibration minimized. As the convoy moved, people stopped to watch. Villagers lined the roads in silence as the Buffalo passed by, wrapped in protective sheeting, her outline unmistakable. Old men removed their hats. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. What is it? Why does it matter? Why do people look sad and proud at the same time? Because history was moving again. At the restoration hangar, BW-372 finally rested on solid ground. The first full inspection lasted days. Conservators worked like archaeologists, documenting layers of paint, corrosion patterns, impact scars. Every dent told a story, a burst of flak, a hard landing. The lake itself. They found no evidence of combat damage severe enough to cause the crash. Engine failure remained the likely culprit, a mundane end to a machine built for violence. And yet, that mundane failure had preserved her. The irony was not lost on anyone. Laaksonen stood back as the team worked. Notebook closed for once. He thought of the night he'd traced lines across a map, chasing a hunch. He thought of the lake's dark surface, indifferent to decades of searching. You waited, he said softly, eyes on the aircraft. Didn't you? BW-372 offered no answer, but she was here. As word spread internationally, offers poured in museums, collectors, institutions eager to claim a piece of resurrected history. Debates flared over ownership, display, even whether the aircraft should ever fly again. Korhonen was firm. She will not fly, he said. She has flown enough. The goal was preservation, not resurrection to the skies, to make her whole without erasing her scars, to let people stand close and understand that war was not clean, not glorious, not distant. BW-372 would not roar again, but she would speak. One evening, long after the hangar had emptied, a young technician lingered by the cockpit. He climbed the ladder carefully and looked inside, imagining the lake rushing up, the sudden silence of a dead engine. He placed his hand on the seat, then withdrew it, as if touching might disturb something sacred. "Welcome back," he whispered. Outside, winter pressed against the walls. Snow fell. Time moved forward, and for the first time in 60 years, BW-372 was no longer alone in the dark. Restoration did not begin with tools. It began with listening. BW-372 sat in the hangar under controlled light, her surface drying slowly, deliberately, as if the air itself had to learn her shape again. Conservators resisted every instinct to scrub, polish, or improve. Touching her too soon would erase evidence no document could ever replace. The lake had written its own record across her skin. Mud clung to seams and stubborn ridges. Algae had traced green veins along rivet lines. The aluminum bore a dull, matte finish, not decay, but preservation arrested. Mid-breath, in places where paint had flaked away, bare metal shone faintly like bone. Each square inch was photographed, measured, logged, because once restoration crossed a certain line, the past could never be put back. The cockpit was opened last. It was a deliberate choice made by consensus. Everyone knew that inside lay the most human part of the aircraft, the place where fear, skill, and instinct had collided at the moment of failure. Opening it felt invasive, like opening a sealed letter never meant to be read. When the canopy was finally lifted free, the smell surprised them. Not rot, not oil, cold metal and old water, neutral, preserved. Inside, the instrument panels stared back, dials frozen in time. Altimeter, airspeed, RPM. Each needle pointed to a moment that had not yet ended for the aircraft. The throttle sat slightly forward, trim set for glide. Callio had been fighting until the last second. Someone exhaled shakily. On the cockpit floor, half buried in silt that had filtered in through cracks, lay a small notebook. Its cover was swollen, pages fused together, ink long since bled into abstraction. But its presence alone was enough. This had not been an empty machine. The discovery reignited debate. Some argued BW-372 should remain exactly as found, mud scars, and all a raw artifact of loss. Others believed careful restoration would honor her service, allowing future generations to see her as she once was, not as a relic pulled from darkness. Laaksonen listened more than he spoke. "You don't restore history," he said finally. "You reveal it." The compromise was painstaking and slow. Structural stabilization first. No cosmetic decisions until the aircraft could support her own weight without artificial cradles. Every action reversible where possible. Every removed fragment preserved. The goal was not beauty. It was truth. As work progressed, stories emerged, some expected, others startling. Microscopic analysis of paint layers revealed field modifications, non-standard markings. Repairs made with whatever materials had been available at frontline bases. This was not a factory-perfect machine. She had been kept alive by mechanics working in freezing conditions under threat of attack, making do. BW-372 had been patched together repeatedly and kept flying. Combat records cross-referenced with the aircraft's scars revealed likely engagements. A dent along the wing route aligned with a reported skirmish weeks before the crash. A flak burst narrowly missed critical controls. She had survived combat only to fall to mechanical failure. That irony hung heavy in the hangar. Public interest intensified as details leaked, not sensational ones, but human ones. Articles shifted tone. The Brewster Buffalo was no longer framed as a failed design alone, but as a tool shaped by context, pilots, and necessity. BW-372 became shorthand for a forgotten chapter of aerial warfare where survival depended less on superiority and more on resilience. Veterans' families reached out. Some shared photographs. Others shared silence, reading every update without comment. One letter arrived with no return address. My father spoke of the lake once, it read. He said the plane went in quietly. He said the water closed like a door. No name, no confirmation. Laksonen folded the letter carefully and placed it in the project archive. As winter loosened its grip, BW-372's structure stabilized enough for a subtle shift from preservation to interpretation. What should people feel when they stood before her? Triumph, loss, curiosity. The team resisted easy answers. War did not offer them. Korhonen walked the hangar late one evening, lights low, the aircraft's shadow long and warped across the concrete. He stopped near the tail, running a hand just short of touching the faded serial number. We pulled you out of the mud, he said softly. Now what? The Buffalo remained silent as she always had. But in that silence was gravity. The first public unveiling of BW-372 was intentionally modest. No banners, no dramatic lighting, just a controlled opening of the hangar doors and a small group invited inside historians, conservators, a few journalists, and people who had reasons too personal to explain. The aircraft stood supported but proud, her form unmistakable even without pristine paint. She did not gleam, she did not pretend, she existed. People approached slowly, as if sudden movement might send her slipping back into darkness. Conversations hushed. Cameras clicked once, twice, then stopped. Some moments resisted documentation. A man in his 70s stood staring at the cockpit for a long time. When someone asked if he was all right, he nodded without looking away. I just needed to see, he said. No one asked what. The exhibit narrative took shape around restraint. Placards avoided grand language. Dates were precise. Descriptions factual. And yet, standing before the aircraft, visitors filled the gaps themselves. The silence did the work. Children asked why the plane was so small. Parents struggled to explain how young the pilots had been. One teenager read the crash summary aloud, voice catching when he reached the words forced landing. She didn't explode, he said, surprised. She just sank. Yes, Laksonen replied. And that's why she's here. Midway through the exhibit path, a simple panel posed a question rather than offering an answer. What do we recover when we raise something from the past? People lingered there longer than expected, because BW-372 was not just a machine retrieved from mud. It was a reminder that history does not always disappear cleanly. Sometimes it waits, intact but unseen, until someone decides it still matters. By the way, if you're clinging to this moment with me, following every rivet and breath of silence, make sure to hit subscribe. There's more ahead, and the story deepens from here. The narrative flowed on. The most powerful reaction came not from experts, but from families. One woman approached Laksonen with trembling hands and showed him a photograph, black and white, creased, showing a young pilot beside a Brewster Buffalo. The serial number was partially obscured. My grandfather, she said, he never talked about the war, But he kept this. They compared details, the cowling shape, the markings. It was not BW-372, and yet she thanked him anyway. Seeing this, she said, makes the silence make sense. Debate resurfaced over the final state of restoration. Should missing paint be reapplied? Should markings be sharpened for clarity? Or should the Buffalo remain visibly weathered, carrying the lake with her into the future? The decision came slowly, painfully. They restored only what time and water had threatened to erase, not what war had done. Structural integrity was ensured, corrosion halted, fragile components supported, but dents remained, scars stayed. The lake's touch was evident in subtle staining that no cleaning could fully remove. BW-372 would not lie. As months passed, the exhibit became a place people returned to, not for spectacle but for grounding. School groups arrived loud and left quiet. Veterans stood longer than anyone else, often saying nothing at all. Some touched the barrier rail as if steadying themselves. The Brewster Buffalo, once mocked, once buried, had become an anchor point for memory. Korhonen watched visitors one afternoon and realized something unexpected. They're not looking at the plane, he said to Laaksonen. They're looking through it. At themselves, at history, at choices made and avoided. On the anniversary of the crash, a small wreath was placed beneath the wing. No ceremony, no speech, just a note attached with wire for what was lost and for what endured. BW-372 stood above it, unchanged. Time did something unexpected to BW-372 once the crowds settled into a steady rhythm. She stopped being an event. Instead, she became a presence. Visitors no longer arrived because of headline or novelty. They came because the aircraft offered something rare: stillness without emptiness. In a world that rushed to interpret history, BW-372 refused urgency. She asked people to slow down, and people did. The museum adjusted its lighting over time, softening shadows, reducing glare. The Brewster's silhouette became more pronounced: stubby wings, compact fuselage, the unapologetic shape of a fighter built not for elegance but for necessity. Guides stopped rehearsing speeches. They answered questions when asked. Silence did most of the work. What happened to the pilot? He lived. And the plane? She waited. That was enough. Behind the scenes, research continued. New documents surfaced as awareness grew: maintenance logs, pilot diaries, supply lists scribbled in pencil. BW-372's story became denser, layered, not bigger, deeper. One log described a winter scramble in brutal weather. Engines reluctant to start, ground crews working barehanded because gloves made fine adjustments impossible. Another noted a successful interception that forced enemy bombers to turn back without a shot fired. BW-372 had protected people who never knew her name. That mattered. Laaksonen often returned after hours. He sat on a bench opposite the aircraft, notebook resting untouched on his knee. For years, his life had revolved around locating lost machines, but BW-372 had changed the nature of his work. Before, recovery had meant discovery. Now it meant responsibility. What happens when there are no more lakes? He wondered aloud one evening. No more buried answers. The Buffalo offered no reply, but the question lingered. A proposal emerged from an international aviation conference, a traveling exhibit, carefully controlled, climate-regulated, limited stops. The idea was tempting. BW-372 could reach audiences far beyond Finland. She could correct misconceptions. She could represent the smaller stories often overshadowed by larger powers. But something about it felt wrong. Korhonen articulated it best. She rested for 60 years, he said. She's earned the right to stay still. The proposal was declined. Instead, the museum expanded around her. Context panels grew. Oral histories were recorded. A digital archive allowed visitors to explore without overwhelming the physical space. BW-372 remained the center, not the attraction, but the anchor. One afternoon, a schoolteacher stood before the aircraft with her class and asked a question no one expected. "Why do you think they saved this plane?" A child raised her hand slowly. "So we don't forget that things can disappear even if they're important." The teacher nodded, eyes wet. The pilot's family eventually came forward, not seeking attention but closure. They stood together beneath the wing, hands clasped, listening as a curator explained the recovery. They asked careful questions. They touched nothing. When it was over, the eldest son, older now than his father had been at the time of the crash, looked up at the cockpit. He said it was quiet, the man said. The water. He said it didn't feel like dying. It felt like falling asleep. No one spoke. BW-372 stood above them, patient. As years passed, the aircraft's meaning subtly evolved. She was no longer just a World War II artifact. She became a case study in preservation ethics, in memory, in restraint. Students of conservation studied her condition, amazed at how little intervention had been required once the right decisions were made. Historians cited her as proof that not all narratives need embellishment. Sometimes survival is enough. On the 10th anniversary of her recovery, the museum did something unexpected. Nothing. No ceremony. No press release. No speeches. Visitors came anyway. Some brought flowers. Some brought notebooks. Some brought nothing at all except time. BW-372 did not need reminding. Late that evening, as lights dimmed and footsteps faded, a young intern paused by the aircraft before locking up. "Good night," she said softly. The Brewster Buffalo, raised from mud and silence, remained exactly as she was, whole, honest, and unafraid of being forgotten again, because she had already proven she could wait. Long after the last restoration report was filed, long after the final debate quieted, BW-372 continued doing the thing Noah had planned for. She endured, not as metal alone but as meaning. People often asked what the recovery had ultimately changed. The answer was never simple. It did not rewrite the war. It did not glorify combat. It did not elevate one aircraft above others lost forever. What it did was remind people that history is not finished when something disappears. Sometimes it is merely submerged. BW-372 became a reference point for future recoveries, not as a template, but as a warning. Not everything should be raised. Not everything should be restored to shine. Not every scar should be erased. Some truths live in restraint. Laksonen retired quietly. On his final day, he walked the exhibit alone, stopping in front of the Brewster one last time. He placed his notebook on the bench and left it there, empty pages waiting for someone else. Because stories like this never belong to one person. Outside, seasons changed as they always had. Snow fell on the lake where BW-372 had slept. Ice formed, melted, reformed. Fishermen crossed its surface unaware that history no longer rested below but above, breathing controlled air under museum lights. The lake had released its secret, but it kept its silence. A final plaque was added near the exit, almost easy to miss, recovered not to relive war but to remember endurance. Visitors read it. Some nodded, some didn't notice. BW-372 did not mind. She had never asked to be understood, only remembered honestly. And so the Brewster Buffalo remained, no longer lost, no longer buried, no longer waiting, not flying, not forgotten, just present. A machine that went into the lake quietly and came back carrying the weight of everything that followed.